Welcome to the Marshall Pruett Podcast, presented by the Justice Brothers, Automotive Chemicals, Additives, and Cleaners, and also Cooper Tires. We are taking a look back on the 30th anniversary of NASCAR absolute rock star Mark Martin's very first victory at the Rolex 24 at Daytona, back then known as the Sunbank 24 at Daytona. This is Mark Martin, all of his amazing charm and skill fed into one podcast about a very specific topic, and that's why I love the guy. As a relatively new member of Jack Roush's NASCAR family that's starting around 1988, Mark was invited to partake in Jack's core activities, the Rolex 24 endurance racing in IMSA. And in the first go-round, it didn't turn out the way that he hoped, but in 1989, got that victory. And Mark then went on to have a lot of success in these yearly one-offs at the Rolex 24, primarily in a Jack Roush entry of some shape or form. This 1989 event, though, a lot of fun. Definitely some good laughs with Mark here, and also some pretty interesting insight. Originally intended to do the entire race in the number 11 Roush Mercury Cougar XR7 with teammates Wally Dallenbach and Darcy Schrader. Some issues there shifted him over to the number 16 entry, led by Pete Halsmer, Bob Earl, and Scotland's Paul Stewart, son of Jackie Stewart. Came home with a victory, 6th overall, in the number 16 Mercury Cougar XR7. And yeah, beyond that, I figure let's just get into our good man, Mr. Martin, as we start off IMSA's 50th anniversary. Definitely a big part of the celebrations, not only for the Rolex 24 this week, but also year-long, and having an absolute nut and beloved cat like Mark spending some time with us, about 40-45 minutes, just bringing us back to 89, also some of the other years, and then also to close on his awesome win and tales of competing with the late and great Paul Newman in 1995 at the Rolex 24 with Tommy Kendall and Mike Brockman, where they won in the somewhat famous Nobody's Fool liveried Roush Ford Mustang in the GTS1 category. Yeah, a little bit of, got a little dusty in the room there towards the end for me, but great stuff with Mark, and so thankful for him to spend some time. We're definitely going to look to do more podcasts about more fun aspects of Mark's career, but here we are today with Mark, looking back primarily on this 1989, his very first victory at the Rolex 24 at Daytona. All of this presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. Mark Martin, you know, one of the fun things about looking back to the 1989 24 Hours of Daytona, not only do we realize that it's the 30th anniversary of your victory in the GTO class with Jack Roush, you're so damn good, Mark, you finished first and second in GTO. So, heck, you got most of the podium covered there, my friend. I figure before we get to telling stories about this really fun year for you at the road course there at Daytona, for those who maybe don't know the Mark Martin story and how you came into Jack Roush's world before the road course racing stuff in '89, tell us about how you and Jack came together, and really, at the time you went into IMSA here, you guys had a pretty good thing going already.
Well, I had, bounced around NASCAR a good bit in the early 80s with some really exciting success early on when I was 22. With a handful of races, but then got in all the way in 82 to run the full schedule, and got in over my head and couldn't make things work, and didn't have the kind of success that I had on a limited basis the year before. So I kind of floundered around and wound up doing different kinds, going back short track racing really to get my career back on track. And in 1986, I had my career back on track and won the ASA late model national championship again back in the Midwest. And I got an opportunity to come back NASCAR racing on at the time, the Busch Grand National circuit. So I took that opportunity to move back down to North Carolina and do that. And we had, and I had been racing in Ford since 1984, so I was kind of in the Ford camp, even though I wasn't a NASCAR driver. And I say by May we got our first win of the season there in '87 with the Busch Series, and then 2 weeks later we got another win, and things started to happen. The phone started to ring a little bit. Things started to happen from the Ford side. Mainly interest from teams like Bud Moore and some of those guys that were running Fords. And I heard that Jack Roush was putting together a NASCAR deal, and I had known Steve Neal for quite some time. And Steve and Robin Pemberton had been hired by Jack to start putting their team together. And I kept hearing from Steve that, I was going to be hearing from Jack. And I kept hearing, and I kept hearing, and I kept hearing.
You kept hearing you're going to hear.
Yeah, and I don't know. I had already had my heart ripped out and stomped on once by NASCAR, so I was not going to, fall into that trap again. But finally, late in the going, I got a phone call from Jack Roush, and he told me that he was putting together a NASCAR team, which I knew, and that he wanted to talk to me about possibly driving it and to come up to Livonia and talk to him. So I flew up there, and he showed me around his engine shop. I knew Jack, and I knew that he was already legendary in road racing. He was legendary in drag racing, and he was already legendary by 87 in road racing.
Yep.
And so, and he was synonymous with Ford, and he had Ford backing to get into the Cup Series, and he had a plan. He had some money saved up, and he had a 2-year plan. He was going racing, sponsor or not. And he told me what his plan was, how much he was going to test, who was going to work on the car. I asked him, was he going to buy enough tires, that kind of thing. He assured me he was going to do all those things. And so we stood up and shook hands, and I headed back to North Carolina and failed to ask him if he was going to pay me for anything or not. But I damn sure had a ride, and that's all that mattered. And I later found out he didn't have plans to pay me very much, but I had a ride. And the first year was tough, building from scratch without team alliances, anything like that, technical associations or anything. We built the organization from scratch, and the first year was tough. We did get a pole. We got close to winning a race at Bristol, and we ran okay. But it was kind of tough. However, by the end of 1988, when we were finalizing our first season, we had a plan of how we were really going to hit 1989, hit the ground running. And we pretty much tested every single week all year long. And we sat on 6 poles, and finally we ran second 6 times. We were, top 3 in points most all year, and had a good season. So we were finally off to the races there in our second year.
So one of the fun things in all that too, Mark, and you mentioned obviously Jack Roush's roots involved turning left and right, and that 88 season actually, I believe you got your first invite to the Sunbank 24 at Daytona in one of his Mercury Capris. I believe you had Lynn St. James, Deborah Gregg, and I believe Pete Halsmer as teammates, and Crash took the car out there, so that wasn't the most fulfilling thing But then we get to 89, and we have these new body shapes, the Mercury Cougar XR7. You know, they look like a door wedge. Just this really interesting shape. I thought they looked great. Sponsored in the Stroh's light colors, so went to something a little bit new there. And a great lineup. I know, looking back, digging out the old on-track magazines, which I try and do to jog my memory and such. I mean, I think about, you got Pete Halsmer, Bob Earl, Paul Stewart, and you in the one car that ended up winning. We also had the sister car with Wally Dallenbach and Dorsey Schrader and yourself. That sister car, you ended up winning in the number 16, but the number 11 was the one that ended up being pretty strong for most of the event, had some mechanical issues. But tell us about working into this 1989 program, and at least from the outset, Mark, I'm thinking you would have gone into the race and said, if we don't mess this up, we might have a pretty good shot of winning our class.
Well, yeah, obviously, Jack wanted to, he had me on the payroll now, as he signed me to go NASCAR racing, so it made sense for him to ask me to come and be a part of the 24 hours there in 88 and get a chance to get to know me and, and get me some more road racing experience. I had run well in rear side in the NASCAR races back in the early 80s and stuff, but so it was a good opportunity for us to get to know each other, and I was teamed up with Deborah Gregg and Lynn St. James, and it was pretty cool. It was an honor to be invited to be a part of something that with a organization that couldn't lose the 24 hours. That division of the 24 hours. I don't think they ever entered that they didn't win. So it was pretty cool. The second year was, it seemed to me like, I took it more seriously, because, I knew more about Jack and I knew more about the organization. I was new with everything and everybody.
Sure.
In 88. And so 89, I felt like I knew the lay of the land. I was teamed up with, drivers that, were really good. It really had a lot of success in road racing, and I was kind of tagging along on their coattails from that standpoint, because they had great background in road racing. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, I had learned a lot the first year that I ran and with them, and so it was really an honor for me to be a part of all that. And we were just building on I gotta tell you a story, because the gearboxes in those cars, I was a little nervous, and 500 miles was a long race to me, and this wound up being something like 2,500 miles, a 24-hour race. So it was quite, I did not want to mess up.
You don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be the guy who gets invited and ends the party early.
Exactly. So I get out there, fumbling, trying to heel and toe downshift this car like they want done. Well, I had used a regular T10 transmission out in Riverside and I ran fifth, I think, in the Cup race in 1982 with a T10 transmission back then, and never used the clutch. I just didn't use a clutch for road racing, even without the straight gear transmission. So I'm trying to heel and toe like they want. I'm raking gears and I'm not doing it smooth. And finally I go to Jack and I say, Jack, please let me shift this car the way I want to. I will promise I won't tear it up. And that was pretty cool. We look back on that now, Jack and I, really fondly, because he scrutinized that pretty hard. He didn't want to to introduce a different style of shifting to his car, because he was serious about winning the race. But he let me do it.
Jack's legendary for micromanaging everything. So yeah, that's not a surprise to hear.
It wasn't easy, but I persuaded him to let me shift the way I wanted to, and we went on, and he looks back on that. We have a lot of warm memories, and that's one of them. Because, that's just how I did. I mean, I grew up driving tractor-trailer trucks when I was 10 years old. I could shift gears, and I knew how to shift without breaking the transmission. And lucky for me, I was able to do that. And I, all through our road racing, I don't think I ever broke a transmission. Of course, we got into those Jericho straight gear trannies in NASCAR, and it made it easy. But for me, it was easy doing it even with a synchronized transmission. You match the RPMs, and with light pressure, it floats right in. And so anyway, that's kind of my interesting story leading up to actually 1988, but 1989 was really cool to be a part of what I felt like was a legendary racing organization in road racing. To be invited to be one of the drivers, along with the great road racing specialist that I was around, I was able to absorb from those guys, and also compete a little bit with them as well.
So you were entered, I guess, initially or originally entered in the number 11 car with good old Dolly Wallenbach, Wally Dallenbach Jr. and Dorsey Schrader. Were you aware at the time, Mark, that Roush either hated you or thought it would be fun to put you in a car with mental patients? Because I cannot think of two crazier guys to share a car with for 24 hours, in a good way, of course, but, I mean, that's not exactly the boring kind of navel-gazing co-driving lineup. You got some wild men there to try and go out and win the race with.
Yeah, no, well, I was already very scared of Jack. And it was quite obvious that Jack didn't particularly like me, so it was no surprise to be lined up with those guys, and it was fun. Wally wound up being a teammate of mine in NASCAR, and Dorsey. What can you say about Dorsey? We had big times and all. So yeah, Jack and I really didn't. We didn't really get warm and fuzzy for a long, long time. It took years and years and years for, I think, Jack to get comfortable with me, and for me to get comfortable with him as well, because I was scared of him. He was real serious, and he held my career in his hands.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't, without Jack Roush, I don't know if I would have made it in NASCAR. And I knew when I signed up with Jack that he held my future in his hands, and he could make me or break me. So, I did whatever he told me to do whenever he told me to do it. And I did it to my best ability, and it took years and years for him and I to really develop what we would consider a warm relationship. We're sort of like blood brothers now. There's not, I love Jack Roush with all my heart, and I truly believe that he does feel that way toward me. But boy, it took at least 10 years to even get close to that.
Wow. Well, looking at the start of the race, Mark, I mean, first of all, Pete Halsmer put the sister car, the 16 car, on pole over the Rocket Sports Oldsmobile by almost 3 seconds. And I'm just looking at just some of the rivals that you had to go up against. In that Rocket Sports car, you had Scott Pruett, you had Paul Gentilozzi, Les Lindley, another super accomplished driver. You move over and look at the Skull Bandit entry with Tommy Crazy Kendall, Max Jones, Buzz McCall, Jack Baldwin. Obviously, there are other entries in the field too, with some highly accomplished GTO drivers. But just among those four right there, the two Roush entries, plus the Skull Bandit car, plus the Rocket Sports entry, I mean, that's a fist fight for 24 hours right there.
Yeah, it was. You know, it was, man, it was a heated rivalry and battle at that point in time. You know, and I wore blinders, man. I had a laser focus. I was lasered in on NASCAR and went and did this, you know, as a sideline. And so I didn't know what we were into or up against nearly like everybody, you know, like the rest of our crew did. And I was just there to try to do my job and not screw it up. But I dang sure did recognize when I got down there and got in the middle of it that, you know, this was a extremely competitive, something that I didn't quite understand when I went down in 1988. My idea of an endurance race was 500 miles. That was my idea of an endurance race, and you know, or 400 laps on a half-mile racetrack. So, you know, it took me a while to learn, you know, how to run one of those races. And I took orders. You tell me what to do. You tell me how hard to run. You know, wind me up, point me, and turn me loose, and let me go do my thing. And, you know, the only thing that I really ask is, once I get in the car, would you please leave me in for 3 stints? Because, you know, I want to, you know, for me, it's a lot of trouble to get ready, get prepared, and get in the car. And once I get in, I want to do my job for a while. And then once I step out, hopefully I'll be out for a few stints and maybe get a chance to rest, which, you know, there again, I was indoctrinated pretty quickly in 1988 that it rained. I'd never been on the wet before. One of the two girls spun in the rain, and Jack grabbed me and he says, "You're going in." I said, "Oh, no. I've never driven in rain, no."
Let me use all my big NASCAR oval rain experience, Jack. Yeah, sure, I'm your guy.
Yeah, no, you're going right now. And so fired me right out there. And, you know, that is like, you know, baptism by fire. And it was the most fun I've had in a race car in my life. I had so much fun after I figured out that I could do it, not wreck. So we had fun there. And I also learned that he wanted me to drive all night, you know. And so we wound up racing, you know, that's what he wound up using me for the first year, was a lot of night driving. And I'm a morning person. I go to bed at, you know, 10 o'clock every night. So, yeah, after the 24 hours, I felt like crud for about 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't, even though I was still pretty young, I didn't recover from it as well as you'd like. But that seemed like the common theme when we did Kendall and I did with Paul Newman in, I think it was 96. You know, Tommy and I raced all night as well, because Jack wanted, you know, he only had one car in that event. He didn't have 2 shots at it. And he wanted Tommy and I to drive through the night. So we did. So swapping back and forth from the tallest guy that I have to use binoculars to see Tommy when I look up. And, you know, as he and I switching back and forth, neither one of us were comfortable. We both compromised terribly. And that was painful. So, you know, I associate the 24 hours of Daytona with pain.
I love it.
Never, I don't, you know, associate it with enjoyment whatsoever.
That is brilliant. Well, before I come back to the racing stuff, you and NASCAR, Mark, were really known as one of, if not the leader or pioneer of fitness, right? You were just known for really upping that level of your game, and certainly many drivers followed afterwards. But you mentioned the being used to 500 miles. That's the thing I'd been, you know, training to endure for my life. And now all of a sudden, as you said, you've got, 24 hours of endurance, not in the car for 24 hours, obviously, but as you well know, you don't exactly go back to the hotel and get a nice 8 hours of sleep before you climb back in for your next stint. So you are enduring whether you're in or out of the car. What did you do, or what did you try and do? What did you learn from that first year, maybe fitness or training-wise, to help you when you came back for 89, or was there not a whole lot you did?
Well, from a training standpoint, my 88 was the first year. I started in January of 88 because that's when my deal really started with Jack. And so the first year from 88 to 89, there was a tremendous transformation in my fitness level. But what I did learn was that because I'm sort of high-strung, I couldn't relax. At night when I'd go back, get out of the car and run back to the motor coach and lay down and hopefully go to sleep, I couldn't go to sleep. And I couldn't relax because I knew that the car was out on the racetrack, and I was anticipating, how long is it going to be before they knock on the door? And so I just couldn't let loose. And so that was one of the things that made it kind of tough for me. 89 was not a whole lot better. I was in better physical condition, but I was not able to really turn loose and go to sleep well. I mean, I might have dozed off some, but I couldn't go to sleep and get any real sleep. We didn't have a set driver schedule. As I said before, I was snatched and shoved in as soon as it started raining in 88, and in 89 it was a little bit better structured. I'm not sure what year it was. One year Jack got mad at Robbie Gordon. And
no, I've never heard of Jack getting mad at Robbie Gordon. How dare you besmirch his good name, Mark?
Yeah, and so I got shoved in, Robbie's rotations. I think that was one of the times when I drove two cars and switched back and forth as well. So you never knew that, we didn't really have a set schedule, and never really knew what, when you were going to be called on. So I had trouble turning loose. I certainly raised my game physically from 88 to 89, and then from 89 to 90, those years were. See, when I first came to NASCAR, I was 21, and I did 5 races with my own car, fielded out of Indiana. And when I got to NASCAR, those crew chiefs, those older crew chiefs like, Herb Nabb and some of those guys that had been there for forever, said I was too little to drive one of those cars. And so after I failed at NASCAR at that attempt, it always, ate it. That ate on me. And so I knew I would never be big, but I was going to be one tough son of a bitch when it came down to driving. When I got with Jack Roush, I was going to be tough, and I trained. Every year that I raced, I trained like a professional athlete, really, really serious, and that's really why I was able to stay competitive and keep jobs in NASCAR over 50.
Yeah.
You don't see that, very often. And it was because of my commitment to fitness. And it was also, great therapy for me. It was an hour a day that I completely escaped the frustrations and the pressures and focused on something besides making a car go faster.
So part of the fun of this 89 race, and I should qualify this again, this is your first win in the class at Daytona. You were pretty good following this year as well in terms of success with Jack, but the car that you were meant to be in, I guess the primary driver in, the number 11, I mean, obviously Halsmer and Dallenbach took off at the start where things are going really well there. And then that 11 car you were sharing with with Dorsey and Wally had a clutch problem. And that was really the first, I guess, hiccup you could say. Interesting thing about that time in IMSA where the rules allowed you, or they wouldn't get too upset if crew members brought the necessary things, or any team members brought the necessary things to a stricken car, and the driver did the work. They really cried foul and penalized teams if any of the team members jumped in to help. So I remember reading about how while Wally had that problem, I believe it was you and maybe Dorsey as well, basically became infield, UPS delivery guys, trying to bring stuff. Did. So tell me about that, because of all the things you do, in a cup race on a Sunday, that's not part of the normal routine, brother.
Well, these things were all kind of new to me, obviously, because it was a different world of racing than I came from. But just golf cart. Here's the tools. Here's the parts. He's over in such and such turn. Go over there and make the parts deliver or whatever. And by the way, here's a couple of $300. Stick this in your pocket. Keep it in your pocket at all times, because if you get stranded on the racetrack, you might need to grease somebody, corner worker or something. Because you could get away with that too. Just no mechanic. None of your mechanical help from your team. So all these things were new, and we were just this was all really cool. And of course, Wally was a veteran road racer, and Pete Halsmer was, he was so intimidating to me because Pete was so, he was so smart, and I'm such a dumb ass. It's terrible. Now, I did make up for that with hard work and trying to pay attention, but I was pretty much, I was a little bit intimidated by the driver lineup that I was with, but delivering parts was right up my alley. This is something that I could definitely do and do well. So that was fun. I had forgotten about that. So I'm glad you brought that up, Marshall. That's fun.
So the story of this race, Mark, specifically in GTO, it's an interesting one because normally when we're talking about Jack Roush Racing and the 24 Hours of Daytona, it's usually some sort of crushing victory, or if there was a little bit of drama, there's a little bit of drama, but nothing major. You knew that this was the super imposing team that almost no one was going to defeat, and despite having these two entries, the story of the race, not just for your team, but also your prime competitors, were problems and attrition, and that was just the other thing interesting, looking at, if you're thinking early, oh man, we got these clutch problems, you guys went down 30 laps ultimately with those repairs, and you go, all right, well, maybe we're out of the race. Well, then the Rocket Sports car with Pruett driving it, then they had some problems with a loose plug wire, and so they lost something like 18 laps, so then they got dinged. Then the sister Roush entry with Halsmer, Bob Earl, and Paul Stewart led just fine, but then had some gear problems of their own, lost 10 laps. Then the Skull Bandit car had another problem. I think they lost a wheel, and then they actually had crew members help, and IMSA gave them a 15-minute penalty. It just seemed to be this back and forth thing where, all right, we're leading, oh crap, what's next? But everyone was kind of getting kicked in the behind. What do you remember of that sensation of seemingly no one was capable of stretching out a lead and holding it before some sort of calamity hit?
It was sort of bizarre because, when our car had clutch problems, we went down 30 laps, we were out of it. But, we felt good about our sister car. And then they have problems. Things are looking pretty gloomy around there, and then all these other guys, they start having problems as well. And it's like, this is crazy. You know, I mean, you know, you didn't know. And that was the thing about that year, is that, you know, attrition or mechanical problems, you know, seemed like the rule, not the exception. And that was the one thing that Roush did all along, was really choose their packages safely. And you wouldn't expect to have problems. And I know some of the years that we went down there, they weren't the fastest. You know, Jack's cars weren't the fastest. Still crushed them because he kept them running on the racetrack. But this 1989 was a year when both cars had issues, and if it weren't for the competition having issues as well, you know, wouldn't have pulled off the win.
So looking back as we get towards the close of the race, the final couple hours, Mark, it's almost like a comedy writer sat down with a drama writer and said, all right, we're going to drop a couple of cartoon anvils here and just sour people's days. But we're also going to ratchet up the intensity of fortune and misfortune. So between the problems you had in the 11 Mercury Cougar and then the problems that they had in the sister number 16 Mercury Cougar, the Skull Bandit Chevy with Tommy Kendall and such, they were leading as we get into the final couple of hours. Then their transmission fails right around noon. They ended up replacing it, but they fell back to third. They were just 2 laps ahead of the of your entry, the 11 car. You guys are trying to climb back. There was a Mazda in there, a screaming GTO Mazda. They were apparently running in second with about an hour to go. Went off course, knocked one of the water lines loose, and then that thing died a steamy death. Even though the Skull Bandit Chevy had problems and lost time because of that transmission replacement, you guys were still a bunch of laps down trying to claw back. Then Dorsey Dallenbach ran out of fuel, and you guys had to go bring him 5 gallons to keep going. And we finally get to a place where the one car, after everyone else had kind of their knees buckle, the sister Roush Cougar, the 16 car, was leading. And that's when they said, all right, well, we're going to slide you in, Mark, and help contribute there in the final hours. So you started in one car as your kind of primary entry, get shifted over to the other one, and you end up celebrating a victory with the great Pete Halsmer, Bob Earl, and Paul Stewart from Scotland. Tell me about this kind of change of fortunes in the final hours, because I'm guessing you're just rolling with the punches, man.
Yeah, like I told you, Marshall, I did what I was told, kept my mouth shut as much as I could. That was a gift by Jack. You know, I'm sure Jack made that call to do that, and you know, I'm sure that he, you know, viewed it as something, a feather in the NASCAR cap, to have me a part of that winning team. And I you know, I'm assuming that there was no other strategy, but you know, something of a gift. And you know, I wasn't used to that anyway, so I was a little bit embarrassed of it. So I just kept my mouth shut, took the picture, and went on. I don't know if they gave out watches back then or not, but if they did, I didn't get one. So
Rolex, if you're listening, we'll get you Mark's address here and get that fixed.
Yeah, I never got one. Maybe because I wasn't supposed to be the driver anyway. But you know, I was involved in a number of wins and never did get one of those watches. So, but that didn't matter. What I did get was, you know, an incredible education, a broaden of my horizons. That particular 1989 race was a gift to be able to be credited as sharing, you know, one of the drivers. I was just in the car, maybe, like you said, maybe a couple hours or something like that. And it was just one of those, more like bring it home. And there again is pressure. Gosh, all this stuff has gone wrong, and now we've got a chance. So let me go out here and see if I can mess this up. So,
one of the other things that comes to mind, Mark, and you weren't the first by any means. I mean, there were some other just legends of NASCAR that came and did the 24 Hours of Daytona in a variety of cars. But I do recall there was a bit of a renewed sense of this being something special, of bringing, a big-name NASCAR star back into the Rolex 24. It maybe been a few years or a little while since there was that fun kind of stock car and IMSA crossover. What do you recall of that dynamic, of just celebrating, I don't want to say fish out of water, but we see this a lot today, right? Fernando Alonso is here racing from Formula One, Alex Zanart, right? It's kind of this, bring some of these really cool characters from different worlds into this 24-hour race. What do you recall about that for you coming from NASCAR?
Well, it was just a privilege for me to be, invited to come participate in a, with a winning team, not just be there and get the experience, but actually get the experience of being immersed in with a team that won all the, every time they went and ran that race. But it's important, I think, to the sport, in general, to broaden. It's beneficial to NASCAR, to IMSA, to anybody in motorsports. If you can broaden the horizon and get more eyes on any given motorsports event, that's a plus for all of it. It's a win for everyone, and that's what I love to see. I mean, I love to see Fernando Alonso. I love to see the NASCAR guys get the chance to come down there and be teamed up on teams now, because it pulls some of the interest from the stock car world onto a very, very important, prestigious race with a long history. And the more that is shared by all motorsports enthusiasts, the bigger the event becomes. So, I'm really like seeing that. And, I'm a fan today, and that's really all I am, is a fan. And for me, it's interesting to see, racers from different backgrounds get a chance to come and compete in that race.
Let me close on this, Mark, and I think I would assume it's something that you cherished. So your final race with the Roush team at the 24 Hours of Daytona was in 95, that unforgettable Nobody's Fool sponsored Ford Mustang with our mutual pal Tommy Kendall. Mike Brockman was in there, and obviously the late and beloved Paul Newman. I'm sure, you meet enough people in your average life, Mark, where you probably don't get starstruck too much. Would I be safe to assume that seeing your name on the top of the driver's door there next to Paul Newman's, that probably had you thinking a little bit like, this kid from Arkansas might have made it?
Well, there again, just such an incredible honor. But Paul Newman is literally cool hand Luke. He's just the coolest guy that you could ever meet. And racer. He's very serious about racing. And even at 70, was quick, was solid as a rock, a fantastic teammate. We went down there. I had the door to my motor coach open, and he comes barreling up in my motorhome and flops down in the chair and just wants to talk about racing. And it's like, dude, this is Paul Newman. But one of the coolest human beings on the face of the earth just came up in my coach and wanted to talk about racing and didn't want to talk about anything but racing. He was serious all weekend. He was all racer. He did his job spot on. That was a tremendous experience for Tommy and I. Tommy and I had a prior up until 1991, Tommy was Chevrolet's secret weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And I was secretly scared of Tommy because I knew he was Chevrolet's secret weapon, and I was Ford, and I was just a Ford driver. I definitely wasn't any kind of secret weapon. So, you know, there was a fierce competitiveness whenever I had to cross Tommy's path, and he winds up at Sonoma in the NASCAR race in Kyle Petty's car. I catch him at the end of the race with 5 or 6 to go, and I got better tires than he does, and I go around him on the outside, and when I lack about 6 inches being past him, he accidentally swerves over and spins me out. Now, this is freaking early in my career. I probably have a grand total of 5 Cup wins in my career, and I'm fixing to drive off and win this race, and he takes me out, and it knocks his valve stem out of his, so he don't win either. And I had a grudge against Tommy like you wouldn't believe. You
wanted to jump out and use his knees as a punching bag.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't do that. And I didn't say anything, and I didn't cry. You know, I didn't complain about it because that wasn't me. But I was mad till 95. And we put this deal together, and I'm like, dang, I'm going to have to share a car with Tommy Kendall. That son of a gun took me out of the win, you know.
I'm going to pee in the seat when I get out of my stint and leave that little puddle for him. Some payback.
Right. But, you know, he and I handled that whole thing very, very professionally, and I treated him with respect, and he treated me with respect. We never once ever discussed it. And so it was a very interesting weekend from that perspective. We raced and we did our thing. He and I drove a lot. We drove all night long. And Michael Brockman did his job as well. And we didn't have the fastest car, but we pulled off the win. And, you know, Jack brought the car in right at the end of the race, washed it, and put Paul in it. And Paul took the checkered flag, and it's the source of Jack and the source of some of our greatest pride. Jack wanted to deliver that to Paul Newman as a 70th birthday present, and against the odds, managed to pull that off. So it was really an honor for Tom and I, and you know, just this past year, Tommy and I had a chance to do a podcast together and discuss that whole event, our careers leading up to 1991, and what that race at Sonoma meant to him and me both. And you know, I couldn't respect Tommy Kendall more. It was one of those things in the racetrack. I can't say for sure that if I'd been him, I wouldn't have done the same thing. It was a career make or break for him. It was one of those days, career make or break for him, and he wasn't going to lose that race. And that's basically what he said. And I accept that much better than I got loose off the corner. I probably wish he would have said that in 91 when he got out of the car. I probably would have got over it quicker, but it took me about 4 years to get over that. But once we raced together in the 24 hours, you know, we moved forward and actually forged a friendship and a healthy respect for one another. So that podcast that we did was really, really fun. It was one of the best ones that I've done so far.
Well, I'm going to make sure folks know where to find that. Mark, thank you so much, brother. You are known for being one of the most generous folks with your time, whether it's with fans on social media or otherwise. So I really do appreciate you taking some time out of your day here to help bring us back to 1989 and your first Rolex win, and then definitely some great stuff here throughout and closing with our late friend Paul Newman. So thank you, brother. Really appreciate you as much as I can.
Well, I appreciate you and what you do for motorsports too. I follow you, and just much respect to you, and keep up the good work.
And that was our good pal Mark Martin. Boy, if you get a chance on YouTube, I'm guessing maybe something on IMSA's official channels, you might be able to go back and find footage and race replays from that 1989 race. You will certainly enjoy it. And knowing that we have another 89 feature this week as well, with the overall winners, Jim Busby talking about that glorious Miller gold and white Porsche 962, driven by the late Bob Wallach, the awesome Derek Bell, and the even more awesome John Andretti. Really hoping that you're enjoying the throwback podcast that we have here. One of the things that's a big part of my passion and my love, so I hope that if nothing else through a little Marshall Pruett podcast here, enjoy going back in time and hearing from some of the legends and heroes and whatnot that made the sport great back when I was coming up, and maybe even before. And I'm sure if this good old podcast keeps going for a few more decades, and heck, I'll be talking to the folks doing it today, but speaking of them in the same way and with the same reverie. All right, I'm Marshall Pruett. This is a Marshall Pruett podcast brought to you by the Justice Brothers and Cooper Tires. Thank you for listening.